The clipboard had a water stain on the lower left corner, shaped like the head of something with a long neck. I noticed it on my first morning at estuary platform scifi and never stopped noticing it. 9 months later it was still there, still shaped like that, and the stack of survey sheets beneath it was 214 pages thick. I should say something about where I was and why, because the place matters to what happened. Estuary platform scifi sits on a composite metal pier, extending 40 meters out over the tidal shelf of the Veloreth coastal settlement of Varathon Call. The Veloreth gave us the pier space as part of the standard xenobiological monitoring agreement they've held with the Interspecies Survey Consortium since before I was born. The platform itself is 3 connected modules: sample processing, data terminal, sleeping quarters bolted together in a configuration that faces east, so the first light of every morning comes straight through the forward porthole and hits the sample bench like a diagnosis. No curtain. I kept meaning to put one up. I never did. The platform was functional in the way field stations are always functional, which is to say everything worked and nothing was comfortable. The sample bench was rated for the equipment and exceeded protocol specifications. The data terminal was 2 models older than what we used in the consortium offices, but ran everything I needed. The sleeping quarters had a bunk and a storage shelf and a viewport over the water that was the most honest luxury of the whole posting. At night, when the settlement sound stopped and the shelf was still, you could lie in the bunk and look out at the water and see the stars, and sometimes, on very clear nights, a faint shimmer in the depths that I learned later to identify. But that came later. I was 26 years old and this was my first independent rotation. Before this, I'd done 3 assisted postings, 2 in controlled biome conditions on orbital stations, 1 on a temperate land species site that was so quiet I'd spent most of my time cataloging soil microbes. Varathon Call was different. It was a working coastal settlement, 11,000 Veloreth living on a tidal shelf and the rock above it, and I was there to do the routine monitoring that had been done every 3 years for 4 decades. Epidermal tissue samples, metabolic panel screening, environmental water column surveys, standard protocols 1 through 17. My supervisor at the consortium, a senior surveyor named Veldassin who I'd met exactly twice, sent me off with a datapad of instructions, a crate of sample kits, and the words "the Veloreth are easy. They cooperate. Don't overthink it." She was right about the first 2 things. I arrived in early spring. The settlement smelled of salt and of something organic I couldn't name at first, a low sweet note under the brine, like something metabolizing at depth. I wrote it down as ambient biological output, unclassified, non-alarming in my first environmental log, because it wasn't alarming, just present. The Veloreth met me at the end of the pier in a delegation of 3. A senior administrator named Sethais Call, who had the patient, measured quality of someone who had done this many times, and 2 younger settlement members whose names I recorded, but whose faces I kept losing in the first weeks, because the Veloreth all share a particular quality of stillness that I found hard to read at the time. They were cooperative, completely cooperative. They showed up for sample appointments. They answered metabolic panel questions accurately and without evasion. They allowed full protocol access. Administrator Sethais Call walked me personally through the settlement's water intake and processing infrastructure on my 3rd day, explaining each system with the kind of detail that suggested genuine investment in being understood. I liked her. I don't say that to soften what came later. I liked her, and I was wrong about what that meant. The first tissue sample batch came back from the bench on my 5th morning there. I was running the bioluminescent cell density assay as part of Protocol 7, which calls for it in any coastal species with confirmed depth diving physiology. The Veloreth are not deep divers in a strict biological sense. They're tidal shelf creatures whose ancestors were, but the diving reflex is vestigial, mostly, so Protocol 7 was technically optional. I ran it anyway because Vel Dasson's notes said the prior surveyor had flagged it as worth confirming. And I was the kind of person who read worth confirming and ran the assay. The number came back. I wrote it in the results column, 144,882. The unit is bioluminescent chromatophore cells per cubic centimeter of epidermal tissue. For a tidal shelf species with vestigial diving physiology, the expected range sits between roughly 4,000 and 28,000 cells per cubic centimeter. Some deep diving species run higher. There are organisms in the abyssal catalogs that go past 600,000. But for the Veloreth, 144,882 was more than 5 times the high end of expected. I wrote it in the column. I looked at it. I checked my equipment calibration twice, both times coming back clean. I ran a second assay on a retained sample, 144,883, within measurement variance. I wrote in the margin, not in the results column, just in the margin, in pencil because I was thinking rather than recording the number again. 144,882, and a small question mark. Then I moved on to Protocol 8, because I had 14 more protocols to run, and this was day 5 of a 9-month rotation, and there was a great deal of work ahead. I should explain what the Veloreth look like, because it matters. They are large, between 2 and 2.5 meters tall in their full adult form, though they move low when they walk inland, a habitual compression of the spine that I came to understand later. Their skin is the gray-blue of deep water at overcast noon, not a consistent color but a shifting one, darker at the shoulder and jaw, lighter at the wrist and temple. They have a secondary epidermal layer that runs from the throat to below the collar, a membrane rather than skin, and in certain lights, the morning light specifically, the east-facing diagnostic light coming through my porthole, that membrane has a quality that I noted in my second week as faint ambient luminescence, possible phosphorescent trace, within range of biological surface reflection. I noted it that way because it was possible it was just surface reflection. I had been trained to note things as what they could be rather than what they appeared to be. That training was correct as a discipline. It was not correct in this instance. The Veloreth have 4 fingers on each hand, long and with a greater range of lateral movement than human digits, and they gesture when they talk in a way that I found beautiful before I found it unsettling. The way anything can shift registers on you when you learn what it means. Their eyes are entirely one color, a deep gray-green, the color of the tidal shelf water on a clear day, and they do not blink the way I do. They blink from the outside in, a lateral closure, so when you speak to one of them and hold eye contact you have the impression that they are looking at you from inside something. I wrote that down too, the first week, in the personal log rather than the survey record. Lateral blink, impression of depth, a just interpretation for bias. Administrator Sethai's call was 63 years old by the Veloreth age reckoning, which in human equivalent put her somewhere in middle-late life. She was the one I spent the most time with. She asked me good questions about my work. She asked about my training, about the consortium, about whether I found the platform comfortable, and whether the smell from the tidal shelf was bothering me. I said no. After 3 weeks I genuinely meant it. The smell had become part of the setting, like the water stain on the clipboard, like the morning light. The first month's data was clean. I mean that in the sense that the numbers were consistent. The bioluminescent cell count across all 12 subjects in my Protocol 7 batch came back between 144,441 and 145,112, centering tightly on that same number. I logged it. I calculated the mean, 144,882. I was not yet circling anything. I was nodding. There is a difference, and I want to be precise about when the difference collapsed. In the second month, I pulled the Veloreth's own prior survey records. This is standard practice at the 6-week mark. You cross-reference your baseline data against the existing record to calibrate your equipment against historical norms, catch any systematic drift in your bench setup, establish your confidence interval. The consortium has survey records on Verathon call going back 41 years. 41 years of protocol, 7 bioluminescent assays on the Veloreth population, run by a rotation of surveyors, checked and archived. I loaded the full record set onto the data terminal. I should tell you what I found exactly, because the exactness is the point. Year 1 of the record, bioluminescent cell density, mean across surveyed population, 44,291 cells per cubic centimeter. Year 5, 61,774. Year 10, 88,302. Year 15, 103,456. Year 20, 119,881. Year 25, 131,204. Year 30, 138,769. Year 35, 142,003. Year 40, 144,441. Year 41, my current baseline mean, 144,882. I sat at the data terminal for a long time. The morning light was coming through the porthole. Outside, I could hear the settlement beginning its day, the sounds of the market on the upper shelf, the bells the Veloreth used to signal the start of the tidal pull hours, the particular cry of the shorebirds that nest in the pier supports. Each of those prior survey records had been annotated, not by me, by the surveyors who'd run them, and by the Veloreth's own internal survey authority, which maintains parallel biological records as part of the monitoring agreement. The annotations were consistent across 40 years. I read every one of them. Year 1, elevated above standard tidal shelf baseline, possible individual variation, no corrective action indicated. Year 5, slight increase over prior record, within expected interannual variation, no corrective action indicated. Year 10, continued slow trend, attributed to diet change, increased depth forage component in settlement meals over prior decade, within parameters. Year 15, trend continues consistent with prior attribution, no new anomaly. Year 20, stable trend, within seasonal parameters. Year 25, within seasonal parameters. Year 30, within seasonal parameters. Year 35, within seasonal parameters. Year 40, within seasonal parameters. I read them all. Then I read them again. Then I went back to my survey sheet from the first week, picked up my pencil, and wrote 144,882 in the margin for the second time. I drew a circle around it. The circle was not aggressive. I was not feeling aggression. I was feeling something closer to the sensation of a door swinging open very slowly in a building you thought you knew, and seeing not another room but a staircase going down. The thing that I need to explain, the thing that the Veloreth's own survey authority had not explained in 41 years of annotated records, is what a trajectory means. A number does not have to be alarming to be significant. A number at year 1 that reads elevated, possible individual variation, and a number at year 41 that is more than 3 times higher is not within seasonal parameters. It is a trajectory. It has a slope. The slope, if I ran the linear projection forward, would hit 200,000 cells per cubic centimeter in approximately 16 years, and it would not stop there, because there was nothing in the data suggesting a plateau. The question was not, is this number alarming? The number was not, in isolation, alarming. Deep-diving pelagic species carry higher counts. Some of them are perfectly functional at 400,000. The question was, what is this number becoming and at whose rate? And the second question, which I did not write down yet but which was present in the room with me, What is doing it? Protocol 7 is a passive assay. It measures what's there. It doesn't ask why. I had two tools for the why question. Protocol 12, environmental contaminant screening, which checks for external biological agents in the water column and substrate, and my own ability to look at what I knew about the settlement's practices and geography, and ask what had changed over 41 years at a consistent rate. I ran Protocol 12 that afternoon. The results came back clean for all standard contaminant categories. No industrial agent, no invasive microorganism, no introduced viral or bacterial vector. I had expected that. What Protocol 12 doesn't screen for, because it wasn't in the standard protocol suite when the suite was built, 60 years ago, is native deep-shelf colonial organisms with direct biological integration pathways. There is a category for them in the newer literature. They are rare. When they occur, the integration is usually so gradual that it registers only as background noise in a standard assay until the integration is far advanced. I knew this from a graduate seminar. One paper, one lecturer, 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning 18 months before my posting. I don't think I would have remembered it if I hadn't already had 144,882 written twice in my margin with a circle around it. I spent the next 3 evenings reading everything I could access on the Dathvel. The Dathvel is a colonial organism of the deep tidal shelf. It is classified as a sessile photophore colony, a vast aggregate of bioluminescent cells organized into something that is not exactly an organism in the individual sense, and not exactly a substrate either. It exists in the deep shelf waters below most established coastal settlements. It doesn't move in the way an animal moves. It grows. It extends integration tendrils. That is the word the literature uses. Integration tendrils. Though they are not tendrils in a physical sense, not protrusions you could feel or see, but biochemical signal pathways that travel through the water column and can, over very long periods of sustained proximity, establish a metabolic communication with organisms in repeated contact with the shelf water. The literature is careful. It says can establish. It says in documented cases. It says the integration pathway requires prolonged and regular biochemical exposure. It does not say this is happening to the Veloreth of Verathon Call, because the literature does not know about the Veloreth of Verathon Call. Nobody has read the Veloreth's 41 years of survey data against the Dathvel literature. Nobody has done this because the Veloreth's own survey authority marked the trend within seasonal parameters for 40 years, and the consortium surveyors who visited before me either missed it or noted it and moved on. I did not move on. I was not trying to be heroic. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what came next, and because I am the kind of person who distrusts accounts of their own virtue. I did not move on because the number was in my margin and I had drawn a circle around it, and a circled number demands an explanation that satisfies the circle. That is a very small and specific thing to understand about how I work, and it is the only thing in this account that reflects on me rather than on the situation I was in. The Veloreth call the Dathvel by a name that translates, approximately, as the depth light. It is not a secret. It is not a religious term exactly, though the distinction blurs, the way it blurs in any community that has lived in close relationship with a large natural phenomenon for long enough that the relationship becomes part of how the community understands itself. The Veloreth fish above the Dathvel colonies. They dive into the shelf water, not deep. The vestigial reflex doesn't take them far, but into the upper water column where the colony's biochemical signal is present. The children swim in it from infancy. The water processing infrastructure that Administrator Sethai's call showed me on my third day draws from a shelf inlet directly above a major Dathvel aggregate. None of this is sinister in the way the word sinister usually means. I want to say that clearly. The Veloreth are not concealing anything. They have no reason to conceal it, because as far as they know, as far as the 41 years of survey data they have access to tells them, the number is within seasonal parameters and has always been. They do not know what they are becoming. That is the thing I sat with in the evenings at the data terminal. That is the thing that kept me at my bench past the end of the working day, running numbers I didn't have to run, because Protocol 7 was already done, and the consortium's instruction sheet said no more was required. In the third month, I expanded my sample set. The standard Protocol 7 draws 12 subjects. I asked Administrator Sethai's call if I could expand to 40. She agreed immediately, the way she agreed to everything, not with the enthusiasm of someone seeking to please, but with the patience of someone who has learned that compliance is more efficient than explanation. 40 subjects, 40 sets of epidermal samples. I ran them over the course of 3 weeks, mornings, the diagnostic light coming through the porthole while I worked. The mean came back at 144,901. The distribution was tight. Not one outlier below 140,000 or above 150,000. The entire surviving adult population of Varathon was converging on the same number. I wrote 144,882 in the margin of my month 3 summary sheet, the original margin notation. I circled it again. The second circle went around the first one. Then I sat and thought about what convergence means. A population whose biological measurements converge, not to the mean of natural variation, but to a specific value, tightly, with decreasing spread year over year, is a population that is being acted on by a single, consistent process. Natural variation doesn't narrow like that. Natural variation maintains spread. Convergence means something is driving the count toward a target. I did not know what the target was. The Dathvel literature doesn't speculate on that. It describes the integration pathway and stops. The data for fully integrated populations is sparse because fully integrated populations have not been extensively studied. The literature notes this as a gap. There was one paper, a theoretical modeling paper from 11 years ago, from a researcher named Vel Hadron at the Orvith Marine Biology Institute, that tried to extrapolate what full integration would look like, biologically. The modeled endpoint was a bioluminescent cell density in epidermal tissue approaching that of the Dathvel colony itself, between 280,000 and 380,000 cells per cubic centimeter. At that density, the paper suggested, the biochemical signal pathway would be bidirectional rather than unidirectional. The colony could, in theory, receive biological information from the integrated organism as well as transmit to it. Vel Hadron's paper had 9 citations. Most of them were politely skeptical. I printed it and put it under the clipboard. In the 4th month, I asked Administrator Sethai's call if I could take water column samples from the shelf inlet. She said yes. Of course she said yes. The inlet water had a Dathvel signal density, measured as biochemical marker concentration. That was 11 times higher than the detection threshold in the standard assay. That is not unusual for a coastal inlet above an active colony. The literature notes that inlet concentrations can run very high. What is unusual, or what the literature flags as significant when combined with tissue sample data, is a close match between the biochemical marker profile in the water column and the metabolic output profile of the tissue samples taken from organisms repeatedly exposed to that water column. A match in profile means the integration pathway is active. The biochemical conversation is ongoing. The profiles matched, closely, more closely than the literature said to expect at this stage of a documented integration sequence. I sat with that for a day. Then I wrote it up in a supplementary findings memo, attached the tissue sample data, attached the water column data, attached the Vel Hadron paper, and transmitted it to Vel Dassin at the consortium with a request for guidance. Vel Dassin replied in 4 days. Her reply was 3 sentences. She said the data was interesting. She said the consortium's standard protocol for this type of finding was to continue monitoring and file at the end of the rotation. She said I should make sure I was getting adequate rest because 9-month postings can be isolating. I read that reply several times. Then I filed it and went back to work. The 5th month. I had been in Verathon call for 5 months. I knew the settlement better than I knew my own apartment. I knew the timing of the tidal pool bells. I knew which part of the upper shelf market had the best filtered shelf water, which the Veloreth drink because the native water suits their metabolism, and the imported filtered water that came on the supply shuttle was, as Administrator Sethai's call once said with measured diplomacy, adequate for guests. I knew the names of the shorebirds in the pier supports. I knew the precise angle at which the morning light hit my sample bench. I knew the pitch of the wave sound against the composite pier struts in calm, whether versus the particular hollow knock it made when the tidal current ran strong. I knew these things without having decided to learn them, the way you absorb the dimensions of a space you live inside long enough. I had by then 4 months of data ahead of me. I had made a decision in month 4 after Vel Dasson's reply that I was going to complete the full 9-month dataset before doing anything else. The consortium's position was clear. Continue monitoring, file at rotation end. I would do that. I would do it exactly and completely. And I would do it with the expanded sample set and the water column data and the full supplementary record. And I would file it in a way that made ignoring it structurally difficult. That was the extent of my calculation. I was not planning a confrontation. I was not building a case in the way you build one for a dispute. I was doing the work I'd been sent to do, more of it than I'd been sent to do, and logging it accurately. If there is a human virtue in that, it is a very small and ordinary one, the refusal to stop counting before the count is done. What changed in month 5 was that I began to see it. Not in the data, in the settlement. I had been going down to the settlement every morning for sample appointments and returning to the platform for lab work every afternoon. 5 months of that routine, and I had been looking at the Veloreth the way you look at anything you see every day, present awareness but not observation, the way you stop seeing a water stain because it's always there. I started observing rather than seeing. The distinction is the circle. The membrane along the Veloreth throat, the one I described in my 2nd week as faint ambient luminescence possible surface reflection, was not surface reflection. It was luminescence, a slow, rhythmic luminescence, visible in the morning light, that pulsed at a rate I measured one morning with my field timer at approximately once every 11 seconds. Once every 11 seconds, a slow brightening along the throat membrane, and then a slow fade. The color of it was the same blue-green as the shelf water, not similar to, the same. The Veloreth did not appear to be aware of it, or they were aware of it the way I was aware of my heartbeat, present knowledge, never conscious attention. When I mentioned it to one of the younger settlement members who came in for sample appointments, a male of perhaps 30 years in Veloreth reckoning, he touched his own throat with 2 fingers and said, "The light," the way you'd say the weather, which is to say, a thing that is simply the condition of being alive in a particular place. The children in the settlement, the juvenile Veloreth, the ones who had been born here, who had swum in the inlet water since before they could walk, had a stronger pulse, more frequent, every 7 or 8 seconds. And in the youngest ones, the infants the settlement members carried against their chest in the woven carriers the Veloreth use, the luminescence was not periodic. It was constant. A low, steady glow along the throat and jaw, visible even at distance, even in the bright morning light. I sat on the end of the pier one morning and watched a settlement member carry an infant past me. The infant's face turned toward the water, not the way an infant turns toward a sound or a movement. The way a compass turns toward north, not a choice, a consequence of what the thing is made of. The infant's throat glowed. I went back to the platform and wrote in my personal log, "The children are bright." That was not a clinical notation. I did not put it in the survey record. I put it in the personal log because I did not yet have the right protocol language for it, and because I had a rule for myself about the survey record. If I couldn't state something in the language of measurement and classification, I wrote it in the personal log first, until I could find the language for it. It took me 3 days to find the language for it. Protocol 7, Subclause 4, Addendum Note in the 2041 edition of the Consortium Field Manual. In populations with confirmed Dathvel integration signal, periodic external luminescence in epidermal membrane tissue is a secondary indicator of active integration pathway function. The subclause had been added 11 years ago, following Vel Hadron's paper. 11 years ago. It had been in the field manual for 11 years, and nobody had flagged it in a survey of Verathon Call, because nobody running the protocol here had had reason to read Subclause 4, because Subclause 4 applied to confirmed integration, and the prior surveys had never confirmed integration, because the prior surveys had logged the bioluminescent count as within seasonal parameters and moved on. I read the subclause 3 times. Then I reread my second-week observation note in the survey record. Faint ambient luminescence, possible surface reflection. I had been looking at secondary indicator evidence on day 14 of my rotation and written it off. I had written it off not from carelessness, but from the same trained instinct that had led every prior surveyor to annotate the count within seasonal parameters. The instinct to record what a thing could be rather than what it appeared to be. The instinct to hold back, to be conservative, to not overstate. That instinct is usually correct. It is correct 99 times out of 100, and the 100th time it is exactly wrong. And the way you find out which case you're in is to circle the number and keep going until you know. The Veloreth were not fully integrated. The model endpoint, the 280,000 to 380,000 cell count, the bidirectional pathway, was still far ahead for the adult population. But they were on the trajectory toward it. They had been on the trajectory for 41 years. The trajectory had been logged accurately in the survey record, and the survey record had been annotated also accurately with a conclusion that the data did not support. I transmitted a second supplementary memo to Vel Dassin, citing the subclause, attaching photographic documentation of the external luminescence in adult and juvenile subjects across the expanded sample set, with a spectroscopic measurement of the pulse frequency and color wavelength confirming the blue-green emission matched the Dathvel colony's own bioluminescent output spectrum. I formally requested that the finding be escalated to the consortium's Xenobiological Integration Review Board. Vel Dassin replied in 6 days. She said she had reviewed the addendum note and agreed it was applicable. She said the escalation request had been noted. She said the Integration Review Board convened quarterly and the next session was 4 months away, which would be after the end of my rotation, and that my filed data would be submitted to them at that time. I sat at the terminal for a while after that. 4 months after my rotation ended, the data would go in. The review board would look at it. Then they would do what review boards do, which is review and then advise and then coordinate a response and then schedule a follow-up survey. That process takes time. That process has always taken time at every institution I have ever encountered, because large institutions are not built for speed, they are built for thoroughness, and thoroughness requires process, and process requires time. I did not blame Vel Dassin for this. She was not wrong to wait for the quarterly session. She was following the structure she worked inside, and the structure was not designed for urgency because the 41 years of prior data had never indicated urgency. But in that time, the children of Verathon Call would keep swimming in the inlet water. The adults would keep processing and drinking it. The throat membranes would keep poolsing. The cell count would keep climbing at its 41-year slope, and faster now. The infant data made that clear. The acceleration was already underway. I was not angry. I was something else that I don't have a clean word for, the feeling of seeing a thing that you are not large enough to stop, and understanding with complete clarity that the only thing you can do is make the record as accurate as possible, and trust that accurate records are, in the end, what matters. It is a very quiet feeling. It is not dramatic. It sits in you the way the smell of the shelf water had sat in the platform, always present, absorbed into the working conditions of the day, noticed only when you stop and let yourself notice. I let myself notice it for the rest of that afternoon. Then I went back to the bench. Month 6. I ran a full extended protocol 7 series on the Veloreth children. There is no explicit provision for juvenile sampling in the standard protocol. It's an adult population assay. I added it as a supplementary study with separate ethical consent documentation, which Administrator Sethai's call signed without hesitation after I explained the scope. The juvenile data was not required. It was not requested. It was not in Vel Dasson's instruction set or anywhere in the standard rotation guidance. I ran it because the subclause said to look at external luminescence in all age groups, and because I had spent 6 months learning to look harder rather than easier when the data suggested there was more to see. The juvenile mean bioluminescent cell density, across 22 subjects aged newborn to 12 years, 178,441 cells per cubic centimeter. The infant subgroup, 12 subjects, age 0 to 2 years, all born at Varathon, all exposed to inlet water since birth, 211,033. I looked at that number for a while. Then I ran the assay again on retained samples, 211,034, measurement variance. The infant population of Varathon was already at the lower edge of Vel Hadron's projected integration range. The infants were nearly twice the adult mean. The adult mean had taken 41 years to get where it was. The infants had gotten further in less than 2. I wrote 211,033 at the top of the month 6 summary sheet. I drew a box around it. Under it I wrote 144,882. Under that I drew the timeline. Year 1, 44,291. Year 41, 144,882. Infant mean now, 211,033. I looked at those 3 numbers, arranged vertically on the sheet for a long time. Then I went down to the settlement for the afternoon sample appointments. Administrator Sethai's call met me at the pier ladder as she usually did. We walked up together through the lower market, the smell of salt and of that low, sweet organic note that I had long since stopped noticing and now noticed again. She asked me how the work was progressing. I said it was progressing well. She asked if I was finding the extended sample set informative. I said I was. She paused at the top of the market ladder, looking out over the settlement and the shelf water. The afternoon light on the water was the particular blue-gray of the Veloreth skin. It always had been. I had been here 6 months, and only now was I working out whether that similarity was incidental. The depth light is strong this season, she said. It was the first time she had mentioned it directly to me, not in the context of water infrastructure or sample logistics, just as a statement about the season. You can see it from the upper shelf at night. The colony shows in the water. I looked out at the shelf. In daylight I couldn't see it, but I had seen the photographs in the literature. The Dathvel in darkness looks like the reflection of a city, a slow, cold blue-green light in the deep water, vast, organized in the way that something very large and very old organizes itself, which is to say not in a way a human pattern recognition instinct fully grasps, but in a way that the body registers before the mind does. It's beautiful, I said, because it was. Sethai's call looked at me then with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not the measured patience. Something different. Something that took me a moment to identify, because I had not expected to see it on the face of a 63-year-old settlement administrator who had watched 11 or 12 different consortium surveyors come and go over the course of her life. It was recognition. You understand it, she said. I didn't answer right away. I thought about what she meant. I thought about what she knew, what the Veloreth knew collectively about the trajectory their survey data described, and what they chose to call it. I understand what the data says, I told her, which was true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we have called it a blessing for a long time. I thought about that on the walk back to the platform. A blessing is a gift from something larger than yourself. A blessing does not require your consent because it is understood as given from a position of knowledge superior to your own. The Veloreth had been receiving this one for 41 logged years, and probably longer. The survey record only went back 41 years, and the Dathvel does not operate on a human administrative timeline. What the Veloreth didn't know, what their own survey authorities' data actually showed, if you looked at the trajectory rather than each year's snapshot, was where the blessing went from here. I thought about that too. The 7th and 8th months were work. I filled out the protocol suite. I ran every supplement I had added. I documented the external luminescence formally in the survey record, with photographic and spectroscopic measurements attached, with citations to the subclause and the Vel-Hadron paper, and the 3 other papers I had found that were relevant. I wrote up the infant data as a formal supplementary study with its own methodology section, its own results tables, its own conclusions. I wrote a cross-reference summary of the 41-year trajectory, showing the slope, showing the linear projection, showing the infant data as an inflection point that the linear model had not predicted. The report grew in sections the way fieldwork grows, not in bursts but steadily, a page at a time, the way water rises. I transmitted the draft summary to Vel Dassin in month 7 and did not receive a reply. I transmitted a follow-up in early month 8 and received a brief acknowledgement. The material was received and would be reviewed before the Integration Review Board session. No comment on the content. No indication of what the review board's initial reaction had been, if there had been one. I filed the acknowledgement and kept working. The shore birds in the pier supports had chicks by month 8. I watched them through the forward porthole in the evenings when the work was done, the parents bringing food to the nest, the chicks opening their mouths, the whole ordinary urgency of it. Something ancient about that urgency, the irreducibility of it, that had nothing to do with any survey record and everything to do with what living systems do. They keep going. They grow toward whatever is available to them. They do not wait for a quarterly review board session. I had been alone for 8 months in a way that is specific to field work, surrounded by work and data and the daily rhythms of the settlement, but alone in the processing of it, alone in the question of what the numbers meant and what to do with what they meant. Fieldwork loneliness is not the same as loneliness in ordinary life. In ordinary life, you are alone because there are no people near you. In fieldwork, you are surrounded by people and alone because none of them are inside the same set of questions. Every evening I sat at the terminal with the data, and every evening the settlement went about its life below the pier, and the gap between those two things, what I was tracking and what the Veloreth experienced as their ordinary life, was not hostile or adversarial. It was simply the gap between inside a thing and outside it. I was outside it. I was there to be outside it. I thought sometimes about what Administrator Sethai's call had said, we have called it a blessing for a long time. I turned that over many evenings. The Veloreth had not been deceived. Nothing had come to them with intent. The Dathvel is not a predator. It is not an agent in the way an agent has choices. It is a vast colonial organism doing what it does, extending its biochemical reach into the environment, the way any living system extends into the available environment, and the Veloreth have lived above it for so long that they are no longer cleanly separate from it. The blessing is real. The data doesn't contradict that. What the data adds is the trajectory, where the blessing goes from here, at what rate, toward what endpoint. And the Veloreth did not have that information, because the people responsible for giving them that information had been looking at each year's data individually and calling it within range. I was not angry at the prior surveyors. I do not think they were negligent. They looked at what was in front of them and they recorded what they saw and they applied the interpretive framework they had been given. The framework was not built for trajectories. It was built for snapshots. That is a structural problem, not a moral one, and structural problems are not fixed by blame. They are fixed by someone running the extended sample set and the spectrographic comparison and writing 144,882 in the margin and circling it until the circle demands an answer. I am trying to tell this accurately and not dramatically, because the drama of it is not in anything that happened. No alarm was raised. No confrontation occurred. Nobody told me to stop. The Veloreth remained cooperative to the last day of the rotation, the way they had been on the first day. Administrator Sethi's call remained patient and measured and occasionally said things that I found myself thinking about afterward. The drama, if there is drama, and I think there is, I think it lives very quietly inside the data, is entirely in the numbers and what they add up to. In month 8, I also did something that was not in the protocol. I went back to the water column samples I had taken at intervals across the 9 months and ran a new analysis on them. Not Protocol 12, not the standard contaminant screen, but a spectrographic comparison of the Dathvel biochemical marker profile in the water column against the metabolic output profile of the tissue samples from the infant population. The match was not approximate. The match was precise. Within the margin of my equipment's resolution, the infant tissue samples and the water column were producing the same biochemical signal. The infants were not just passively accumulating the Dathvel's integration pathway. Their tissue was responding with the same signal, bidirectionally, at least at the biochemical output level, before the cell density had even hit the theoretical integration threshold. Velhadron's model had been conservative. The infants had already crossed a threshold the model projected was 16 years away for the adult population. I sat at the terminal with that data for the better part of an evening. Outside, the settlement sounds were the evening ones, the market closing, the water bells marking the end of the tidal pull hours, the voices of the Veloreth children somewhere below the pier. The light through the porthole had gone the orange rose of late afternoon, and then the deep blue of coastal dusk, and I sat with the spectrographic overlay on my terminal screen and watched the two profiles, water column and infant tissue, sit on top of each other in almost perfect alignment. It was a beautiful piece of data in the way that any precise correspondence is beautiful. The lines matching each other peak for peak, trough for trough, without noise or anomaly, a clean confirmation that the two things were having the same conversation in the same language. I printed the overlay. I put it in the report folder. Then I turned the terminal off and went to sleep. In the last week of month 8, I began drafting the final report. The full document, not the summary memo, not the supplementary studies, the complete 9-month report, formatted to consortium standards with all attached data, all supplementary studies, all citations, all the trajectory analysis, the infant data, the spectrographic comparison. It took 4 days. I did not work quickly. I worked carefully, the way you work when you know the document is the one that matters, not the draft, not the summary, but the thing that goes into the permanent archive and stays there regardless of what any quarterly review board decides or any supervisor replies. The archive is the one institution that operates without a process delay. You transmit, it receives, and the record exists. Everything after that is downstream of the record. The document ran to 243 pages including attachments. I read it in full before I queued it for transmission. I found 3 places where my language was less precise than it should be and rewrote them. I found 1 citation that was not in the standard format and corrected it. I found a table in the supplementary infant study where the column headers were misaligned by 1 position and fixed it. Then I read the executive summary one more time. The executive summary was 4 pages. It stated, in the language of measurement and classification, what 243 pages of data showed. That the Veloreth population of Varathon Call was in active Dath-Vel integration, as confirmed by bioluminescent cell density trajectory over 41 years, epidermal membrane luminescence consistent with Protocol 7 Subclause 4 secondary indicators, and spectrographic correspondence between infant tissue metabolic output and colony biochemical marker profile. That the infant population showed integration pathway activity in advance of the adult model timeline. That the trajectory, if continued at current acceleration, would reach theoretical full integration thresholds within the current generation's lifetime for the youngest cohort. That the Veloreth's own survey authority had logged the data accurately for 41 years and had interpreted it as within seasonal parameters, a classification that the full trajectory did not support. That recommended next steps included immediate escalation to the Xenobiological Integration Review Board, supplementary field study of the infant cohort by a specialist in Dath-Vel biology, and most importantly, a direct and complete disclosure of the survey findings to the Veloreth administrative authority at both colony and system level, in their own language, in terms their own governing structures could use. That last recommendation was the one I had added in the final week. It was not in Vel Dassen's instruction set. There was no protocol that required it, but the Veloreth had given me 9 months of access and cooperation, and their community's tissue samples and their settlement's water, and the least that cooperation deserved in return was the complete truth about what the data showed, not the sanitized version that would arrive through institutional channels in 4 months, the full version. I had sent Administrator Sethai's call the explanatory note the prior evening. It was the right order of operations. It was long. It was the longest document I had ever produced. I had been a professional for 4 years, and this was the first thing I had made that felt proportionate to what it was describing. The last day. I got up at the usual time. The morning light came through the porthole and hit the sample bench. The stack of survey sheets was 214 pages, topped by the clipboard with the water stain in the lower left corner. I had processed and organized every page. The data terminal had the full report queued for transmission. I had a list of 6 recipients. Vel Dassen, the Integration Review Board, the Veloreth's own administrative authority at the colony level and at the system-level survey commission, and the Dath-Vel research team at the Orvith Marine Biology Institute, where Vel Hadron worked. I had added the last 3 recipients the night before. They were not standard transmission recipients for a routine rotation report. I had sent a brief explanatory note to Administrator Sethai's call the previous evening, telling her that the survey findings were being transmitted to the relevant scientific authorities, and that the Veloreth's own administrative authority would be receiving a copy. She had replied with 2 words, "Thank you." I transmitted the full report at 6:13 settlement local time. The confirmation codes came back within minutes, one by one, 6 receipts. The data was in the archive. The trajectory was in the record. The infant data was in the record. The spectrographic comparison was in the record. All of it transmitted, all of it confirmed received, all of it now part of the permanent survey history of Varathon Call. Then I did what I always do when a task is complete. I went back to the beginning. I picked up the clipboard, the stack of survey sheets underneath it, 214 pages, organized chronologically, first day to last. I turned to the front sheet, the Protocol 7 results from my first week, with the number 144,882 in the results column and the same number in the margin, written in pencil, with the question mark. The first circle was still there. Light pencil, the circle of someone nodding rather than deciding. Then the second circle around the first, from the day I pulled the 41-year record and saw the slope. That one was darker. The pencil had gone harder on the paper, not in anger but in the specific pressure of understanding something you'd been close to for weeks. I picked up a pencil. The third circle was the one I drew last. It went around both of the others. The same number, the same margin, the same sheet. I had drawn the first in week 1 without knowing what I was holding. I had drawn the second in week 6 when I knew the shape of the question. I drew the third one now at the end of the rotation, knowing the shape of the answer. The third circle was not harder than the second. I was not angry still, and I was not afraid. I was the exact thing I had been for 9 months, a person doing her work, logging what she saw, refusing to call a trajectory a snapshot. I set the clipboard on the bench. The morning light was on it, the diagnostic light, east-facing, the light I'd never put a curtain against. Outside I could hear the settlement beginning its day. The tidal pool bells, the market sounds. Below the pier, a splash and a child's voice, one of the juvenile veloreth in the water already in the early morning in the inlet above the colony. I put my field bag over my shoulder and walked out of the platform module and down the pier. The water beneath the pier was clear and lit from below with a faint cold blue-green. The Dathvel doing what it always did, what it had been doing before any of us came here, what it would keep doing long after the review board convened, and the follow-up survey was scheduled, and the process moved forward at the rate that processes move. The clipboard was on the bench. The number was in the margin. 3 circles, the third one going around everything that came before. I don't know what happens to the veloreth. I don't know what happens when the cell count finishes its climb, when the infant generation reaches adulthood, and their children in turn grow up in the shelf water, fully immersed from the start, when the bidirectional signal becomes something neither the Dathvel literature nor Vel Hadron's careful modeling has language for yet. I don't know if blessing is the right word or the wrong one, whether what the veloreth are becoming is a loss or a transformation or something that doesn't sit inside either of those categories. I know what I wrote down. I know I wrote it accurately. I know the 3 circles are in the record, in the transmitted archive, where no annotation that says within seasonal parameters can sit on top of them unchallenged, because the circles are there, visible, demanding the explanation that satisfies them. The supply shuttle came at 900. I was waiting at the end of the pier. Administrator Sethi's call came down to see me off. She stood at the end of the pier, and we said the formal departure things that protocol requires, and then she looked at me for a moment with that expression I had seen once before, the recognition, the thing that said she knew what I had seen. "Will they listen?" she said. I thought about that. I thought about Vel Dasson's 3-sentence reply. I thought about 4 months and a quarterly review board session. I thought about 41 years of accurate data sitting under 41 years of an annotation that said, within seasonal parameters. "The record will listen," I said. "Eventually the record makes everything else listen." She was quiet for a moment. The water below the pier caught the morning light, and for a second I could see the Dathvel's glow through the clear shelf water, faint, distant, vast, patient. The way very old things are patient. "Yes," Sethi's call said. "I suppose it does." The shuttle loaded, I got on. I have been back at the consortium for 11 weeks. The building does not smell of the shelf water. It smells of recirculated air and the coffee that runs in the common room machines all day, and the absence of the other smell was something I noticed for the first 2 weeks every time I came in through the main entrance. I notice it less now, the way you stop noticing things. The integration review board session is in 3 weeks. My report is on the agenda. I have been asked to attend in person and to be prepared to walk the board through the infant spectrographic data in detail. Vel Dasson sent a message last week saying she had reviewed the full report and wanted to talk before the session. We have a call scheduled. I do not know what she will say. I think she will say that the findings are significant and that the process will proceed, and that I should be prepared for the session to generate further questions that will require further study. I think she will be right about all of that. I got a message last week from Vel Hadron at the Orvith Marine Biology Institute. She had read my report. Her message was long. It covered the spectrographic comparison first, in technical detail, asking 2 specific questions about my equipment calibration methodology that I answered fully. Then it moved to the infant data. The last paragraph said that she had been waiting 11 years for someone to go back to a coastal settlement with an active Dathvel integration signal and run Protocol 7 with the expanded sample set and the spectrographic comparison, and that she was glad it had finally happened, and that the infant data was going to change the conversation. She asked if I would be willing to co-author a paper on the findings once the review board session had concluded. I replied yes. I read that message several times. Then I went to my desk and looked at the clipboard I'd brought back with me. The same one, the water stain in the lower left corner, the same shape as a long-neck something, the 214 survey sheets beneath it, and at the front sheet on top with the number 144. 882 written in the margin 3 times, each circle smaller than the one around it. 3 nested rings around a number that had been sitting in the data for 41 years waiting for someone to stop calling it within range. It was morning. The light was not diagnostic, just the ordinary light of the consortium building, overhead panels, nothing special. But I sat for a while anyway. The record had the 3 circles in it. That was enough to start from.